All right, so it's 8 o'clock, and we're going to get some AP Euro review going. My name's Paul Sargent, and I'll be starting off the review for you today. The idea here is to kind of get you ready for the exam on Friday. So I'm going to be taking questions using Twitter. You can follow me at psargent, or you can use the hashtag AP Euro review. You can see all that sort of right down here, and I'll try and answer as many questions as I can. We'll have Tom Ritchie joining us a little bit later and sort of get you guys going for this whole thing. So I guess we might as well get to some of the questions that have been coming in. I've already gotten a couple. First question is about the agricultural revolution. So this agricultural revolution that you may hear about is really sort of the beginning of the sort of the industrial revolution. And the idea is that agriculture kind of drove the whole thing. You have a change in the diet of Europeans that's really sort of picking up in the 18th century or 18th century, where you have the new foods which are coming over through the Columbian Exchange, and you're having an improved technology in terms of the way that farming is going on. And really with those two things, you have this ability to sustain populations which are just much, much, much bigger. By planting crops that will replenish the soil in the off season, farmers don't have to leave the fields kind of fallow, not growing anything. And by having new foods, you can grow things in areas where maybe old foods wouldn't grow. The big example of that really kind of, I think, drives the point home is the potato, which, can grow on very small plots of land and yield lots of potatoes, but also can grow in areas where maybe traditional agriculture wouldn't really work all that well. And you add to that some of the technological innovations like the seed drill, which spaced out the seeds perfectly and sort of drove them down into the ground. And you have this huge abundance of food, which is really better able to sustain the population. And so with that agricultural revolution and being able to sustain more people, then you set yourself up for an industrial revolution. You're going to have more people as a workforce, and you're going to have more food that can be produced and sent to the cities, and you're going to have you might need fewer people to farm the land. So there's going to be more stability, and there's going to be more there's going to be just more people, I guess. And one of the things that you may see this referred to as is this Malthusian problem, okay? And this comes up through the writings of a guy named Malthus, who basically said, if people continue to reproduce, they're going to outstrip the ability to produce food. And then there's going to be widespread famines and stuff like that. And that will naturally sort of like keep down population to a workable level. Well, the agricultural revolution kind of blew right through that, because it provided food that, sort of no one saw coming. So, oh my gosh, questions are coming in left and right. We got a lot of people online, 256 people. Let me just, while I got you here real quick, I want to highlight my, I'm going to try and do a screen share here and see what I can do with the thing. Hold on one second. All right, so that's not what I want. I want screen share. Okay, so yeah, just this is wanted to show you that my I don't know what's happening. All right, so you can see here, this is my YouTube channel right here, and I have a whole bunch of videos on here. If you go to the AP Euro Bit by Bit playlist, there's 50 videos there which will help you review for the exam. The AP European History videos, I don't even know how many I have in there, but there's quite a few. So these can help you as you go along. And you can also find a lot of resources on my website, which is sargnotes.com. And if you go to AP European History, I've got pieces on the, pieces on the historical thinking skills, which kind of walk you through all of the different things which you're supposed to be able to do on the exam. I also have some things on the historical themes that walk you through that. And I have the whole concept outline here from the College Board in a nice, easy to use kind of layout here. And then lots of other pages on every single topic that we do all through the year, and one big one on the review. The review site is nice because I've got some videos that I made last year about how to get ready for the exam and how to tackle each part of the exam. So those are all there for you at sargnotes.com. And I can then stop sharing and, all right, jump right back in here with some other questions. So let's see, what do we have going on here? Can we talk about enlightened despots? All right, Christian Ochoa. All right, enlightened despots. So the Enlightenment obviously comes along, and the Enlightenment is this time period where philosophers are trying to talk about sort of how to improve human society and how to make life better for people, and so forth and so on. So there are a group of absolute monarchs. You know, despots is a word that's tossed around. You know, it's an awfully harsh word, but anyway, they're absolute monarchs who believe in divine right monarchy. They believe in sort of absolute power in the ruler, kind of along the lines of the absolute monarchs like Louis the 14th. But they try and institute some of these reforms. You know, they emphasize education. They push for religious tolerance. They grant some freedom of speech, pull back on censorship, those sorts of things. And the three people that you're going to want to associate with that are Joseph II of Austria, and Frederick the Great of Prussia, and Catherine the Great of Russia. And they've succeeded at various degrees. Catherine is not all that successful because opening up a lot of the, giving a lot of freedoms to people in Russia leads to this, you know, this big rebellion by a guy named Pugachev, and her response is to kind of crack down on this stuff. Joseph II of Austria has limited success with enlightened reforms, and Frederick the Great, you know, he's kind of hemmed in by his need to support the nobility, which is going to sort of limit his ability to be as enlightened as he would like. But it's sort of this attempt to kind of meld the two together, the ideas of the Enlightenment along with sort of this absolute monarch tradition that's going on there. And so, you know, it's an experiment which doesn't really do all that well, even though it's a nice try. You know, kind of foreshadows some things which are to come. All right. Now, one of the things that that people ask, we got a question here about the English Civil War. So in the English Civil War, this is a time, if we sort of backtrack to the time of absolutism, you know, this is a time when you have this conflict that is almost uniquely British. Okay, absolute monarchies are taking hold all throughout Europe. You know, then the great poster child is Louis the 14th in France, and in England, you have the rise of the Stuart monarchs. Stuart monarchs come along because Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudor dynasty, doesn't have any children, and so they have to mess around with the family tree, and they end up with the Stuarts. And the Stuarts are, you know, the James, Charles, James. One of my students sort of described it as like a hamburger at some point, but with like two buns, and the Charles are the buns, and the Jameses are, you know, sort of the middle, I guess, with Cromwell kind of shoved in the middle of all that. But it's a power struggle that's going on all throughout Europe. But the English have a very powerful parliament. And so parliament has the power to raise money. And James I initially, and Charles I after him, have a need to raise money in order to fight wars. And this leads to conflicts with Parliament, because Parliament begins to push back, and they begin demanding that in return for increased taxes and more money to fight these wars, that these kings sort of sign over power. In other words, agree to place limits on the power of the monarch, and both of them, say no. Well, this leads to a real clash with Parliament under Charles I, and Parliament ends up fighting a civil war against him, led by a guy named Oliver Cromwell. And under Oliver Cromwell and his new model army, sort of pushing new tactics and new military technology, they're able to defeat the forces of Charles I. And they end up going so far as to, cut his head off. You want to stop a monarch from having the ability to take back power, you kill the guy and he's gone. So then Oliver Cromwell takes over, but he very quickly realizes that a parliamentary rule is not going to work as well as he would like it to work. And sometimes, at least he believes, you have to kind of just grab power and have it at the center of it. I always kind of think that Cromwell is really driven by his military career, I mean, in the military, you tell people where to go and they go and they do it. You get into government and you tell people that you want to do something, and all of a sudden you might have arguments on your hands, and people are going to want to debate it, and people want to challenge your authority, and people want to run against you and all of that. It doesn't always work out the way you'd like. So, so he basically takes power, and he rules almost as a monarch until his death. He even puts his son up as being sort of the successor. Well, Parliament sees his son is not Oliver Cromwell. Parliament sees that there's a problem here, and so they look around and they say, hey, let's grab Charles II, who is Charles's son, Charles I, son, the guy whose head they cut off, and let's put him on the throne. Let's bring back this Stuart monarchy. And they do, and it works out for a while. Eventually, the end of all of this is the Glorious Revolution of 1688. And in the Glorious Revolution, what they do is Parliament kind of brings in Mary, who is, gosh, the family tree gets a little confusing. She's a Stuart. She's the sister of these guys. And her husband William of Orange, and they offer them the throne of England in exchange for signing the English Bill of Rights, which puts sort of this limitation on the power of the king. And so in Britain, at a time of absolute monarchies throughout Europe, Britain ends up with a constitutional monarchy. In other words, a monarchy that exists, but with a written constitution that reigns in the monarch's absolute power, making it pretty unique at the time. So you may see questions which are going to ask you to compare, the absolute monarchs that existed and the absolute sort of the constitutional monarchy that existed in England at that time. So gosh, I'm seeing a lot of people jumping on. This is absolutely great. Let's see. Can you please explain Romanticism and how it's a greater concept than just any art movement? Okay. That's yeah, I certainly can. I'll be honest with you. Romanticism is my favorite art movement because I'm an emotional guy, and this stuff's just absolutely great. So the Romantic movement starts in the sort of late 18th, early 19th centuries when it really kind of gets going. And as an art movement, it emphasizes emotion. It emphasizes sort of the older sort of reminiscent medieval things. It emphasizes the supernatural, and it emphasizes like the power of nature. But throughout it all, like emotion is at the heart of it, like this real impassioned belief in things. And so as an art form, it's meant to kind of like drive the emotion of the viewer. But it does, you're right, jump out into many other areas of European thought. There's romantic literature. Les Miserables, the great novel by Victor Hugo, is a great example of romantic literature because it's sort of like over the top, like, oh my gosh, it's always going on, how heart-wrenchingly bad life is at times, and how love completely overcomes, and self-sacrifice, and all of these great things, and yet there's still misery. And I mean, if you've ever read the book, or if you've ever seen the play or the movie, like, you get the ideas behind all of this, and that's a very romantic ideal. But as a political ideology, it's also kind of taken up in terms of driving movements that that are going to rise up against the more conservative old school monarchies in 1830 and 1848, in which sort of there's this belief that people will unify behind an idea, that if they're strongly emotionally attached to the idea of a better France or the idea of fighting for a unified Italy, you know, that people will like take to the streets and they're going to lay their lives down in honor for this country, and you know, and the art kind of backs it up and the literature kind of backs it up, and they want everybody to jump in there, but it just doesn't seem to happen, you know. And so, so as a political movement, maybe Romanticism is less successful than it is as an artistic movement, and because the art here is just absolutely fantastic. Let's see. Vanessa wants me to ask for any wars of religion. I think the easiest, Vanessa, to understand is the French Wars of Religion, simply because it's a pretty straightforward story. I mean, it's messy when you get into the details, but all of like history is. Essentially what you have is you have the Huguenots, which are French Calvinists, okay? And the Calvinist religions, when they kind of move out from Calvinist Geneva and they start spreading to other areas, they kind of take on their own form and they take on their own name. And really, Calvin had created sort of a very portable form of Protestantism. And anyway, so the French Huguenots, who have a great deal of the nobility in France, use this movement as a way to fight the like political power of the king, which you know, kings have been trying to consolidate power throughout the Renaissance and into the Reformation period. And so these nobles use they use their Calvinist beliefs as a way of rebelling against the king, and ultimately it leads to some pretty nasty wars. And it's amazing during this time of the wars of religion, just how bad people, just I guess how nasty people can be to one another, how violent people can be to one another in the name of a peaceful religion. And you have massacres and you have wars and you have all of these crazy things going on. And in the end, what you have is a Huguenot king that wins it. And he's Henry of Navarre. When he's crowned the king of France, he's the fourth Henry, so he becomes, well, Henry the Fourth of France, and realizes that he can't be a Huguenot and hold France together. And so he converted to Catholicism, but he also then issued what I think is a very important document in terms of European history, one that you'll probably see somewhere on the exam, although I hate trying to like game the system here. But the Edict of Nantes. And in this, he goes out and grants religious freedom and to the Huguenots, and he even grants them cities where they can fortify and they can be protected from you know, Catholic forces. And so the French Wars of Religion essentially end with you know, with like a truce, I guess, and an edict that allows the two competing religions to live together in the same country. So kind of very successful here. Let's see what we got here. Benno Larkin, there's a shout out to Mrs. Perkins' class. The revolutions of 1848 she asked about. And so, yeah, those things, I mentioned them before, but the revolutions of 1848 kind of sweep through Europe. France starts the whole thing off trying to overthrow their sort of constitutional monarch that they have, and try to, you know, like, hey, you know, let's go with this, let's go with like a republic. And it's the pushing of ideals of the Enlightenment, sort of old ideals of liberalism, which is really like classical liberalism, the ideals of the French Revolution, and trying to you know, trying to get rid of some of the old order of aristocracy and monarchy and those sorts of things. So they take to the streets. They're successful in getting themselves an elected leader. If you call successful, meaning that, you know, pretty soon he's going to turn himself into the first or the next emperor of France. But it starts a wave of movements that spreads throughout Europe. Now, most of these are, straight up unsuccessful. But what you see is nationalities try, or let me put that a different way. You see the forces of nationalism really kind of coming together. And these forces of nationalism are going to work off the ideal that people who share a common bond, a common language, culture, history, et cetera, should have a government that they all live under and that represents them. And so you have, this translates itself into separatist movements by the Hungarians in the Austrian Empire. It leads to unification movements in Italy, unification attempts in Germany, and then it leads to uprisings in lots and lots of other places. In almost every instance, they're just violently put down. But it kind of sows the seeds for a lot of what's to come, because these are driven by romantic ideals, which I talked about just a little bit earlier. And it leads to the realization of sort of the next generation of guys that, there needs to be kind of a new look at nationalism. Nationalism needs to be used. And so you have what are sort of conservative people that start using nationalism in order to further their political ambitions. And so, in the next period, the realist period, you start to have the unification movements in Germany and Italy, which are more successful because they rely more on sort of realpolitik, real approaches to these problems, and less on sort of romantic ideals. So 1848 is a big year, and yeah, that kind of sums that up. Let's see. Boy, questions are coming in all over the place here. Austin Camden is asking, what is the Russian Revolution? Well, that's certainly one that that changes the course of history. So the Russian Revolution really happens in 1917, and as with most other things, it can be incredibly complex. It starts out as sort of this dissatisfaction with World War I. Tsar Nicholas is fighting World War I. In fact, when I say fighting, I mean honestly, like the guy was at the front lines, and what people were really kind of upset about were a few things. Number one, they're fighting a war that they're losing badly. Number two, their military is severely under-equipped for this war. I mean, honestly, here's what they did. The Russian army didn't have enough productive capabilities to give rifles to all the guys in the army. So they would tell people who were going off to war when they didn't get rifles, they said, hey, you know what? We're fighting a trench war here. There's going to be lots of people dying. When you see someone die, grab his rifle. And now you have a rifle. That's not the way to fight a war. Meanwhile, back in Moscow, you have the Tsarina who's there, and she's sort of increasingly listening to this kind of weird guy named Rasputin. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of factors that are leading people to kind of like want to change things. And then you add on top of that the factor that tends to drive lots of revolutions, and that's food shortages. Because there's not enough food to go around in Russia, but largely it's because a lot of the food is being rushed off to the front in order to feed the troops that are fighting. And so with a shortage of food, with an ongoing war, with a king that doesn't seem to be able to hold on to power very well, and sort of just this growing frustration with everything, there's a first revolution in February. And that first revolution is going to try and sort of be a moderate revolution. This is very much along the lines of the French Revolution. Starts off as a very moderate revolution. But the provisional government that they set up is just unable to keep things going. And so with that provisional government, what they do, they try and rule for a little while, but the Germans kind of see their way through it. They grab this guy named Vladimir Lenin, who has been exiled from Russia. He's been calling for a communist revolution. They arrange for his transport right into Russia. It's like injecting a virus into the system. And when they do that, he comes in and he says, hey, you give us power, we're going to give you bread, we're going to get out of the war, life will be better. And so there's a second revolution, and that's the communist revolution, the Russian Revolution. And when it takes hold, it happens very, very, very quickly. And the idea is to set up by force sort of this communist country. But there's problems, and one of the big problems is that Lenin had like promised to get out of the war, and so he starts negotiations with the Germans to try and just stop fighting. And the Germans demand huge amounts of Russian territory, which he gives them in order to get out. And so he ends the war, but then has to fight an ongoing civil war for another 4 years to try and consolidate his power against all the other forces, which are sort of just against the communists. In the end, what will happen is the Soviet Union will emerge out of all of this. And this is going to drive like 20th century politics for, up until the fall of communism, because, this is like, I mean, when you get to the Cold War, you have this divide between the East and the West, between the democratic West and the communist East, which is driven by the Soviet Union, which came out of this one revolution. So that's kind of a quick overview of some of this. And man, questions are flying in here. Keep in mind, if you do have some questions, because I'm not going to be able to get to everything here, you can check out my YouTube channel, and you can check out Tom Ritchie's YouTube channel. We've got videos that cover many of these things that you have questions about, especially if it's like, explain this and tell me how this kind of went down. We have really good videos which are gonna explain those things to you. So hopefully that will help. One of the things I want to take a moment to talk about, though, I think is a question that this guy Bob put forth. It's kind of funny. I was about to answer, and then here it is. Centuries and dates. Okay. As you're getting ready to sit down and take this exam, it can get so confusing. I mean, there's so many details. There's so many trends, movements. What century does this happen? What century does this happen? And the test is going to ask you centuries. They're going to say in the mid 19th century, blah blah blah. And so, how do you sort of keep this straight? I think the easiest way to do this is just to kind of think of the chronology in which you learned this course. Most textbooks will follow this kind of thing. Now, I'm going to do this off the top of my head, so this might not be totally accurate, but it's a good rule of thumb. All right. If this course starts in 1450, so if you're talking like that's the 15th century, so usually 15th, 16th century, I just kind of throw together, right? So 15th and 16th century are your early parts of the course: the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration. Those are going to be kind of like the big three in the 15th and 16th centuries. In the 17th century, you're really going to focus on the, and I'm trying to do all this off the top of my head, sorry, the Age of Absolutism. You're going to talk about the Scientific Revolution, and that's about the 17th century. When you get to the 18th century, then the focus turns to the Enlightenment. The focus turns to sort of this ongoing warfare between Britain and France, and enlightened absolute monarchs, and the French Revolution. Also the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. When you get into the 19th century, this is where you start to get a whole lot of stuff laying itself down. You have the intensifying of the Industrial Revolution, the Napoleonic era. You have the age of Romanticism and ideologies. You have the age of Realism, where you have these national unification movements. You have the age of Imperialism, and you have this like sort of onset of like the Second Industrial Revolution and some of the technological advances that come with it, and some of the sort of theories that start to make people uncertain about what's going on, like evolution, for example. And then when you drop into the 20th century, You have sort of an expanding of power that leads to World War I with alliances and new technologies and things like that. You have this period between the wars where they're trying to avoid another war, but it just doesn't work. And so you have a Second World War, and then you have the Cold War period, which finishes that out. So that's kind of a, I don't know, quick and dirty way to divide it into the different centuries. In terms of that, though, I mean, I think it's important to understand that you're not really going to need to know a lot of dates on this test because they don't really ask those types of things. And if you can pull dates out when you're writing essays, that's great. But I think you can write a good essay without using any dates. And in the DBQ, I mean, every document has a date, so there you go. But generally speaking, when you're talking about multiple choice questions or something like that, you can probably get through a lot of it without really encountering any dates as a whole. There are some that you should know, especially what they call the hub dates, like the three turning points that the College Board has identified: 1648 with the Treaty of Westphalia, 1815 with the Congress of Vienna, and then 1914 with the onset of World War I. And those are like the three sort of turning points. And there are secondary dates that, like, it's nice to know, but those are sort of like the main ones. Let's see. People are asking a lot about Cold War stuff. So the Cold War, really, I think people have a lot of problems with the Cold War because I think that we as teachers kind of run out of time, and at least I do. I don't know about your teacher, but I usually run out of time, and I end up like cramming the Cold War in at the end, and not doing a great job with it. There's a lot of stuff that's in there, but what the College Board is looking for is kind of a broader understanding of this period. You're not going to be asked about a lot of like the flashpoints of the Cold War. You're not going to be asked about the invasion of the Bay of Pigs. You're not going to be asked about the Cuban Missile Crisis. You're not going to be asked about the space race. What they want you to really understand is that after World War II, you have this period where the divisions between the two sides of Europe intensifies, with an Eastern Europe which is being increasingly controlled by the Soviet Union, and then a West which is democratized and has sort of taken a back seat to the United States and sort of jumps in and lets the U.S. take the lead. And the Cold War is going to be fought in the hearts and minds of people. In other words, trying to win people over to one side or the other. But it's also going to be fought in what are called proxy wars. And proxy wars, if you think about like the Vietnam War, it's a great example of a proxy war. They never wanted to have this situation where Russian soldiers are fighting American soldiers, because once that happens, then you open up a whole lot of nasty doors, and one of them could be the nuclear missile door, and you don't want that one. So So in a place like Vietnam, you have a war that breaks out between a communist North Vietnam and a democratic, why not? We'll go with democratic South Vietnam. And U.S. forces actually go in and fight on the side of the South Vietnamese, which you probably know. On the North Vietnamese are financed and armed by the Soviet Union, but both sides are very careful. Like, we're going to invade places, or we're going to attack places in the United States, but we got to make sure there's no Russian soldiers there. And the Russians are sitting there saying, maybe we shouldn't send soldiers, maybe we should just send aid. The idea is there are wars that are fought in different places which fight this Cold War, but it never turns into a hot war because the two sides never fight. I mean, one of the most intense battlefields, I don't know that I should go that far. One example of a place where the two sides fight is like the Olympics. The Olympics for many, many years is all about like who can win more gold medals, the United States or the Soviet Union. So therefore, who's better, and kind of it goes back and forth. Along with that, along with this period of Cold War, then you start to see Europe realizing after World War II that they can't continue to do things the way they have, that they've been weakened so much by two world wars that they can't be like strong imperial and world powers like they were, which leads really to two things. Number one, it leads to decolonization, where different former colonies, or I guess at the time, different colonies of these imperialist countries gain their freedom from their imperialist rulers. Alongside that, you have Europe increasingly realizing that in order to stay viable in the world with these superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, that increasingly they have to unify. And it starts off as economic unification, and it melds into the European Union. And the idea is that by forming bonds, sort of economic bonds, but also, economic bonds in terms of like trade, but also economic bonds in terms of like a common currency, the euro, and a European Parliament. That those things are going to bring everybody together, make everyone better off that's involved. At least that's the general, ruling ideal. And then it's going to, but it's also going to prevent warfare. People who are that closely tied together are not going to fight each other, especially when the borders come down and they allow for free movement of people throughout Europe, without any border checkpoints and that sort of thing. Like, it's really hard to fight a war with somebody if you're that closely tied in with them and you're using the same currency and all of that. It's just, it kind of goes. I don't know how I got onto that when I was talking about all of this. My goodness, questions are just flying in here. This is crazy. Okay, women's movements is something that I'm seeing a lot of. So women's movements, the women's movement you can kind of think of as a gradual upward curve throughout the class. There are very, very, very defined gender roles, especially in the upper classes, in the early part of the course. And that's going to hold on for a while. I mean, women are going to have some advances early on, but generally speaking, women are going to be, they're not going to have the same rights as men. This maybe intensifies with industrialization, where you start to see this ideal that women, especially as we get into like the later industrial period, that women really should stay home and they should raise children, but underneath this you have a growing women's movement that's calling for more political equality, and especially in the mid to late 19th century, in the early part of the 20th century, there's an increasing move for the right to vote. And World War I is really the thing that kind of brings this to a head, because at the end of World War I, you have women receiving the right to vote in, most of Europe, most of the West. And then kind of the women's movement dies down a little bit, and it's sort of reinvigorated the 1960s and 1970s, when there's sort of this realization that the vote, which was going to be sort of the answer to all the problems of inequality that women were experiencing, wasn't really doing it. And what was needed was more of a movement for equality of women. And there were some successes there. Women have been able to push for more rights. They've been able to push for more equality. But even still today, there's a discrepancy between pay for men and for women in the West. And old gender stereotypes still hold on, and I'm sure everyone out there knows knows kind of about that. Let's see. Can you go over? This is a good question. I think this is where some of you might want to start focusing your time. The question is, can you go over how to get points for the writing portions? Like, how do you get a 2 out of 3 on the short answer? The short answer is a really very straightforward part of the exam. I mean, it's going to tell you exactly what it is they're looking for. All you got to do is answer the question. You have to answer it very directly, because you only get like one sheet of paper, and you got to write, your whole short answer on the one sheet of paper. So if it asks you to, it'll say maybe like identify one of these and then identify 2 of these, and so you identify, you talk about it, you give an example. You basically just answer the question. when you go over the writing portions, there's all kinds of tips and tricks that are out there about how to remember how to write a good DBQ, how to remember how to write a good LEQ. I tell my students, look, on the exam, they're gonna give you, like, right in the instructions, they're gonna tell you exactly what it is. So you don't need to remember it so much. If you have those instructions sitting there, which at the beginning of like the writing portion, it says, make sure you have a good thesis. Make sure you use six documents. Make sure for at least 4 documents you identify point of view or context or the author's purpose or the audience. Be sure to use synthesis at the end, and they even give you examples of how synthesis can be used. So if you use the instructions, then you can sort of check them off, and as you're writing the essay, I always tell people, start with the context, give the big picture. You may notice when I answer questions that I always tend to start with context, because I sort of think historically this way, like I've been doing this for years. And so once you've started off that way and you've written context, like, you can flip to the instruction period and you can just put a check mark next to context, and you can say, hey, look, next it says thesis. I got to write a thesis. Next it says use the documents. Okay, I got them already. I'm going to use them. And so you go through and you can write the essay and get the points, and really just check off the points as you think you got them. And if you've been practicing writing, then this is going to be a lot smoother. Really, just realize when you're writing the essays that everyone's under a time crunch, and no one has the time to revise a good essay. People who write, very short, not so good essays are going to have plenty of time to revise them, but they won't have much to revise because they're, so the readers are going to expect that you're under a time crunch. They're not going to expect some polished super essay. So you go through and you follow the directions, you do what you need to do, and you're done with it, and you hope that you're done with it fast, is sort of my advice. Let's see, I got did revolutions of 1848. I got a question here from Megan about Impressionist art and what you should know, and shout out to Olma. I don't know who Olma is, but hey, Olma. Let's see. Impressionist art. Impressionist art is really actually very important in the history of art, because it's the first real move away from traditional art that's been around since the Renaissance. The Renaissance created this idea of representing the real world as it is. In other words, trying to depict nature, people, things, life as it exists. Now you can emphasize things. Movements like the Baroque will emphasize awe-inspiring awesomeness. The Romantic period will emphasize emotion. The Realist period will emphasize sort of real life. But the Impressionists, who are really responding in a very real way to the invention of the camera, which now can depict real life very easily, they start to try and create paintings which are not depicting the reality as it exists, but they're trying to play with how an impression of the reality can happen. And they start getting away from being very, very meticulous about their art. They use very large brushstrokes. When you look at Impressionist paintings, they're really characterized by large brushstrokes that that don't look like the fine detail that we may be used to seeing in art up until this point, but bring together a moment. They don't use outlines. That's I think, tip off number one for Impressionist art. Like, you look for outlines and they're not there. They just use colors. Plus, they try and play with how light affects things. So they'll paint the same picture over and over and over with different lighting times. Monet. I always forget who did the Rouen Cathedral. And I'm on the spot here, but there's a series of paintings about the Rouen Cathedral at different times of day, different times of year, different lightings, and here they all are the same picture, but they're meant to create, to capture a moment in time and like the artist's impression of what that moment is. And so it marks this change in art from depicting reality as it is to depicting an artist's view of reality. And it's really the beginning of modern art, which is going to be very interpretive and which is not going to be sort of focused on portraying the real world, but it's going to be focused in different movements on getting a response or from the viewer that conveys the ideas of the artist. Although I'm not very good at explaining modern art, so that's kind of like the best I can do here. Let's see. We're seeing. I'm seeing a couple of questions here about the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is one where, I mean, if we get into the details, this answer could go on for 45 minutes, and I don't want to do that. The French Revolution really, like, you have to understand that it's a response to sort of the problems of the old regime, the ancien regime, and its three estate system. It was a very hierarchical thing. It was held in, it kind of reflected an old medieval mentality of the clergy, the aristocracy, and then like everybody else, which didn't really exist anymore. As as you have the rise of cities and you have the rise of education and all of these things, and also the rise of trade, which is creating a big merchant class, which is very well educated and really kind of believes that they should get the same rights as the aristocrats. Most importantly, the right not to pay taxes, because who wants to pay taxes? I don't want to pay taxes, but I'm not going to have a revolution about it because, we figured out a more equitable way to do that. It's not like if I'm, in the American aristocracy, if it exists, that I would then be exempt from taxes, So I don't have that beef with taxes, but it begins with that. And so the initial days of the initial part of the French Revolution is going to be fairly moderate. It's going to be driven by people who want to create a constitutional monarchy. They want to rein in the power of Louis XVI. They want to create representative assemblies which have the voice of the people behind them. They want to create a new constitution, and they want to take away some of the traditions which have been used by monarchs in order to hold power, like control over the church. It becomes more radical because, people who have more radical sort of Republican ideals want, and not Republican like as in today's American Republican ideals, but Republican ideals as in let's create a representative democracy, a republic kind of thing, rather than have a king at all, especially after the king tries to like flee the country and go raise armies to like fight against the revolution. And then it takes a turn into this radical phase of the revolution where they try and dismantle everything of the old society. They try and take away all power of the church. In fact, changing the calendar so that it doesn't even reflect church holidays. So that it takes away Sunday, so people don't really know when Mass is, where they push this ideal of a republic of virtue that you should be, that should be worshipped. But of course, as we all know, they go way too far and they institute a reign of terror, start cutting lots of people's heads off, and then kind of cooler heads prevail. And so there's this tenuous period for a little while after the end of the reign of terror where the French Revolution is kind of just trying to hold on to everything. They're trying to fight enemies from the outside. They're trying to stop all of the different factions that are fighting on the inside from tearing the country apart. And ultimately, they're unable to do it with anything other than the army. And that gives the army a whole lot of power. The big guy in the army, big guy not in stature, but in influence, is Napoleon Bonaparte. And Napoleon Bonaparte, as he sees that this directory, which is the government, which is ruling at this period, is unable to really take hold on things, well, he participates in a coup d'etat, overthrowing that, instituting a new government, which will eventually become his French Empire, and he will become the emperor of the French. and essentially look a lot like a monarch, but a very successful monarch who ends up taking over most of Europe, and gives us the lasting lesson that, like, yeah, Russian winters, you don't mess with those, especially not with the military. He didn't do so well. Hitler didn't do so well. Yeah, it's just not, you just don't fight land wars in Asia, you know, to quote a little famous movie passage there. All right. Okay, let me just give a little sip here before I move on here. All right. Cassius Smith is asking about more Enlightenment stuff, okay? And he says your class and you are confused. Well, the Enlightenment is an outgrowth. It's an intellectual movement, okay? And in the Enlightenment, there's a search for sort of order to human societies, and a desire to find what would create a perfect human society, or at least a better human society, using the power of human rational thought to come up with, well, this makes sense that things should be this way. For example, they argue against the rule of absolute monarchs because they say it doesn't make sense that you should have one person with all the power. Hey, how about this? How about we rationalize that at some point there wasn't a government? We're going to go John Locke here, although he's maybe a little bit too early for the Enlightenment, but let's go with it. There was time where there wasn't a government, so why would people join a government? Well, obviously, probably things were really unsafe without a government because people, the strongest would survive. So, people would come together and they created a social contract where they said, like, okay, government, ruler, whatever, you can have power and we'll give up some of our freedoms for security. And so if you believe that, then power comes from the people, and the people might have the power to overthrow a ruler who doesn't guarantee their natural rights of life, liberty, and property. You have the Baron de Montesquieu, who talks about there needs to be a division of power, or separation of powers, really, in the government, where the executive, the person or the group that carries out the law should be separate from the legislative that makes laws, which should be separate from an independent judiciary, which can determine how those laws, like what those laws mean and how they should be applied. And you have sort of this attempt to discuss all of these new ideas, and throughout salons, these little sort of formal discussion parties, it's almost like a book club, but like way over the top. And in these salons, these ideas are discussed and they're talked about, and these ideas spread. The Enlightenment, really, if you want to think of what comes out of it, I mean, the U.S. Constitution with its Bill of Rights is a great example of sort of Enlightenment thought all kind of smashed together into one big thing, at least governmental Enlightenment thought. So there's lots of other questions, checks for like the meaning of what's reality and those sorts of things, but we won't get into that too much because you don't need to know all that much about it. So that's kind of basically the Enlightenment. Hope that cleared things up a little bit. Boy, I am running way behind. I'm going to flip to some more recent questions because I'm looking at questions that I don't know if people are still even on here. I will say, wow, we have 500 viewers right now. That's really pretty awesome here. Let's see. All right, I got one from Zach here, which I think is a really good question. How or what should I study over the next day or two in preparation for the exam? This is a question which I think pretty much all of you are asking yourselves on some level. And I think the answer to that, Zach, is really dependent on you. If you're good on content and you need to worry about the skills of taking these multiple choice questions or writing these essays, then do some of that and practice at it. If you're pretty good at writing essays, but you're not all that strong on content, then maybe you need to go back and you need to spend some time looking over content again. And you can do that in lots of ways. I mean, you can watch videos. I have videos. You can watch my videos. They're like the videos, you know. You can watch videos. You can go back and read sections of your textbook. If you have access to a review book, then one of these test prep books, then those are gonna help you out. You can just sit there and realize, hey, I never understood, for example, the last question. I never understood the Enlightenment very well, and so you can Google Enlightenment. You can read a little bit about it. The idea is understanding what it is that you need to do and where you're weak. And I hope that at this point you understand where you're weak, you know where you're weak, and you're willing to take that on. That's where I would spend my time getting ready for this. Now, if you have questions about different parts of the exam, like I have a series of videos where I went through and kind of broke down a video for each part of the exam, which really kind of went into like tips on maybe how to do it, how to approach it, what they're looking for, and you can use those and hopefully be a little bit more confident going into all of this. Ashley Pinkham is asking for a piece of Westphalia discussion. And Ashley, I have a good video on the piece of Westphalia, so check that out, because that one it's a very important thing, and I want you to get all of the information on that, because that's one of those hub dates. 1648 is kind of like things change, and it marks this break from religion being the major motivation for conflict in Europe to political and dynastic concerns being the major source of major source of conflict throughout Europe. So it becomes, that's what sort of makes it that thing. But in terms of the war and the peace, check out my video on the Peace of Westphalia, and you'll be able to see that. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice here for a second. I've just been screaming a lot this afternoon. And if you're wondering why, I have to tell you, because I coach track, and we had a track meet today. So I was running all around the infield of the track, screaming at athletes, encouraging them along, which is just awesome fun. Like, what better way could you spend an afternoon than to run around and encourage runners? It's awesome. So anyway, sorry, I'm getting off topic here. Let's see, what else do we have here? Christine says, why did you ignore my 1848 revolutions questions? I did already cover the 1848 revolutions. But again, this is another one of those things, like I have a video that you can watch about the revolutions of 1830 and 1848. So if you missed what I said earlier about these revolutions, or you didn't understand it because I kind of was just rattling on, then check out my video on those revolutions, because I think that sums them up nicely, kind of puts them into a historical context that you can work with. Brittany asked about the difference between constitutionalism, socialism, Marxism, liberalism, etc. Yes, these 19th century isms, very, very confusing. But they can be very easily brought together, okay? In any age, conservatives are going to want to preserve the way things have been done, and liberals are going to want to try and change things. And so that there's always that conflict, okay? During the early 19th century, you have sort of the backlash of the French Revolution. The French Revolution unleashed a lot of ideas. It unleashed the ideas of liberalism, which is like political freedoms and constitutions, which would set forth guarantees of power and limits on power of rulers, and the idea that people should have basic rights which rulers can't take away, and so liberalism is the idea that governments should be really more responsive to the people, and that the idea of absolute power based on birth is an old idea that probably doesn't hold a whole lot of water anymore at this point. it's sort of bolstered by nationalism, which is this belief that people who kind of share common traits, language, history, all of that, should be brought together under one government, and the romantic ideal of like, let's jump on emotion and go get it kind of going. Socialism comes about as well, because socialism is kind of a push for a better world. Socialism is a response to the Industrial Revolution. This is a very important point. It's a response to the Industrial Revolution because the socialists see the Industrial Revolution as creating, or sort of like showing, the problems with capitalism. As the capitalism is all like, go and make money and make as much money as you can, and yeah, right, go for it. You're going to be rewarded. You're going to have lots of money. Socialists look and they say there's an increasing gap between the haves and the have-nots, and they're both motivated. The gap widens because of the capitalist motivation. I mean, if you own a factory, your motivations are to make as much money as you can because you're a capitalist, and to pay your workers as little as you can because, there's other workers out there who will work for less. So why would you pay workers more? You just kind of, no, that doesn't make sense. But as this progresses, the weakness of capitalism shows up, which is that it creates economic disparities. And so the socialists say, there's got to be a better way to do this. And the better way would be if everyone banded together and created sort of a classless society, almost, where there is, where everyone kind of contributes to the society without trying to take more than their share or more than really what they need out of the society. So that's kind of socialism. Marxism is socialism with sort of a revolutionary edge to it, in terms of there being a series of Marxist revolutions which will sweep through the world, and they'll drive out all of the bourgeoisie, all of the factory owners and the wealthy, and they'll create a workers' paradise. And that workers' paradise, once created, will inspire other people to create workers' paradises, and those will demolish all sense, because they'll surpass all sense of nationalism. National borders will fall, and the workers' paradise will rule the world. It's kind of like the ultimate end of that. So all of those ideas kind of come together, and they're being fought out in the early part of, and the early to mid 19th century is sort of the big part here. So that's that. Jenna and Katie asked a question. What do you think is going to be, you asked what is going to on the AP, but I think you mean to be. Then teach that. That's a great question. I don't know. Second guessing the College Board is not a real money-making enterprise here, because there's no telling what's going to be on that exam. I think that your best bet is to know a little bit about a lot. And what I would emphasize here, and I think this is something that we tend not to emphasize, because history can be so interesting. And as we're telling stories, like, the stories are the things that drive us as historians. Historians, like, we just love telling stories. That's why, at least that's why I got into this. I think I love a great story, and there's no better stories than the stories in history, because, like, you can't make this stuff up. It all kind of happens. But really, if you understand the large trends, then that's going to be far more valuable. If you see the progression of industrialization, if you see the progression of Europe's interaction with the world, and I say progression meaning just sort of like how it develops, not so much like as it gets better, because there's arguments that maybe it doesn't get better as time goes on. Maybe we'd all be happier on the medieval farm, living subsistence lifestyles. Who knows? We wouldn't work as much. I certainly wouldn't be up after dark videoing, talking about other people's lives, which is what I'm doing now. Could be sleeping on my farm. Well, in the house on my farm, I guess. But anyway, yeah, I wouldn't try and second guess this stuff, because you're going to try and game it, and then you're going to try and throw all of your time into something that you think might be on the exam, and you could very well walk away and it's not really represented very well on the exam. So I would say have a broad knowledge of everything, and just be able, especially, I mean, with the DBQ and the multiple choice questions, be able to read these documents and be able to interpret them and put them into some historical context that's recognizable. Because if you see the big picture and then you have something to work with, then you can use that in order to better answer questions about, you know, the big picture and stuff like that. Let's see. Women I already talked about. The age of, here's a question about the 100 Years' War. 100 Years' War is before the period of this class, so you won't need to know literally anything about the 100 Years' War. I mean, it ends in 1453, so technically, could that be something that would be on here? No, because while it ends in 1453, you have to understand that the College Board has given everybody like all of the stuff which could be on the exam. I hope you guys have seen this, and if you haven't seen it, then you know you can go to my website, which is sargenotes.com, and if you find the Euro link there, there's a thing called the concept outline. Literally, the College Board has said, here's what you need to know in order to take this test, because this is the only stuff which can be tested. And the 100 Years' War is not on there. There are a lot of questions here about, Austin is going crazy about the age of anxiety. All right, Austin, because you're going to overwhelm me with this stuff, I'll give you a little bit of anxiety, or at least the age of anxiety, not anxiety. You and Mr. Watson. So the age of anxiety is really this period of time in the late 19th and early 20th century where people start to become a little less certain about this move of progress. I mean, throughout European history, there's been this idea that, well, this feeling, because I'm going to use the word ideas, there's been this belief that ideas and ideologies, along with maybe technology, will further the progress of Europe, and that Europe will become better, and the lives of Europeans will become better. And you know, so there's this constant push, better, 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 right? And by the end of the 19th century, science, technology start to really raise some questions, which gets people kind of uneasy. I mean, you know, science is great when it's explaining how planets orbit, and when it's advancing into medicine, and you know, like people are living longer, and you know, when science is used to make more food, like these things are great. But when science then goes out and suggests there's evolution, and that people might not have been divinely created, but might have evolved from primates, apes, well, it gets people a little uncertain about things. Then, so they kind of rely on, well, you know, hey, at least we know that there's an order to the universe. And then scientists like find out that there are things in the universe, like the insides of atoms, which behave inexplicably and randomly, which suggests that there is no order to the universe, that the order of the universe is actually maybe a figment of imagination. And so it's this time of uncertainty where people are not really like sure that the way they're going is the right way. And as and this is going to be intensified by like World War I, when they see that technology, and especially military technology, which had really been working for Europe in terms of, you know, imperialism and you know, taking over a lot of the world at the expense of a lot of other people. Let's just say that right now. But for Europeans, it had been, you know, pretty successful. That when those weapons, when turned on other Europeans, create massive destruction. And like, this is the technology, this is the progress, this is what we've been working for. Like, is this the end of history, that we've created something so incredibly crazy? And drive that into the you know, 1940s and 1950s, where you have the atom bomb and then the hydrogen bomb, and all of a sudden, like, man has created a weapon that's so powerful that it can annihilate mankind. We don't think about that much, but there's still a lot of nuclear weapons out there. Just ask North Korea. They've got some. Enough about that, because that's causing anxiety in me. I'm just going to move on. Let's see. What else do we have here? Okay, I got to answer this one because this is great. Ricky Zhang, I think. Why don't people learn from their mistakes? That I don't know. You know what, Ricky? I'll tell you this. This is what I've learned over years of studying and teaching history. People are really bad at recognizing their mistakes. They're really bad at learning from their mistakes because they don't see things with the perspective that we see things from. When people are acting in the moment, there are emotional drives to do things. There are inexplicable, irrational decisions that people make, rulers, individuals, whatever, that people make throughout history, which when we look back on them, we go, you know, if you hadn't done that, maybe everything would have worked out just fine. Like Napoleon. If you hadn't invaded Russia, like maybe the French Empire would have lasted longer. I'm not saying that it would last forever, but maybe it would have lasted longer. And maybe Napoleon, you could have died happy in Paris somewhere, you know, somewhere else, I don't know, on the battlefield or whatever. But, you know, you wouldn't have been exiled twice, you know. But people don't always behave that way. And we're almost duped into believing that they should because the story has been completed. And then people, historians, have gone back and analyzed that story, and literally they've given us in our textbooks, like they've given us like, here's what they did wrong, and you know, we really should say like, why did you do that? And so to us it seems very easy to say, yeah, well, of course, why shouldn't you do that? But we all make irrational decisions all the time, you know, and we don't learn from our mistakes. We don't learn from our mistakes. I mean, if we learned from every mistake we made, we would ultimately, you would think, not make any more mistakes, but we do. So we're human. I mean, that's what it's all about. And yeah, Ricky, that's a good question because that kind of gets to a lot of stuff. I don't know how testable that is for Friday, but that's a good question. Let's see. Here's a question that I think I need to discuss, and it comes from Kenzie, which is, how can I make sure I finish the multiple choice section? Kenzie, here's the reality. Some people are going to finish the multiple choice section because they can read quickly and they can process fast. They know their history and they're able to just kind of plow through this thing. They might even finish early and go back and check some of their answers. But for the rest of you, you got 55 minutes to answer 55 questions. Those 55 questions are attached to these stimuli, with some of which are maybe a paragraph long. So you're going to have to like make some decisions. If you've been trying to test at this pace, and I hope you've at least, you know, tried some tests that are gonna work, like the timing of the whole thing, where you've tried to do a question a minute. If you find yourself running out of time, then you've got one of two choices. And I don't know which one is maybe the better choice, but you'll know for you, I guess. Choice A is you go through as much as you can. You just move through, you try and pace yourself, you try and keep going throughout the whole thing, and then you get as far as you possibly can. And then if there's a few questions that are left, you simply bubble in an answer for each one. And I mean, if there's only 4 choices, you got a 25% chance on those, right? Option B is that you're aware of the things that you don't know very well, and you're aware of the things that you do know very well. And so when you come to a stimulus, you know, like a written passage, for example, that asks about, that is from Voltaire. Okay, it's an Enlightenment writer. You've got a passage from Voltaire, and you say, hey, you know what? This is Enlightenment, and I remember the Enlightenment well. Gosh, I studied that last night. I watched Paul Sargent's video on the Enlightenment. I got this. Well, then you go through and you try and answer those questions. Then the next set of questions, maybe you get something about the rise of fascism in the 1920s, and you have some, I don't know, you got some Nazi propaganda poster, maybe something like that. And you go, hey, you know what? That was getting into the spring, and I was really ready for spring break, so I really wasn't paying all that much of attention. And I figured, like, everyone knows about the Nazis anyway, so why sit around and try and sort of work this through? Well, then maybe you skip those and you move on to the next set of questions. And then when you get to the end of it, then you can go back and you can say, all right, now let me try and look at the questions that that I wasn't really that sure on those time periods, and see what I can get out of them. See if I can get a question right here and there. Maybe I know more than I think, or maybe the stimulus that's there would help me answer the questions. And that way, if you run out of time, then you've got some questions left over that you weren't really sure about anyway. And so that might be, you've hit your high percentage shots, you've hit the periods that you think well, and now you're left with the others. And so if you guess on those, the difference between the likelihood that you get the right answer and guessing with a 25% is maybe, smaller. It is the big, is the idea. Okay. Let's see. There's a lot of questions here that I've already talked about with some of this. Let's see. Oh gosh, I'm losing. You guys are asking so many questions here. My goodness. All right. I'm just going to randomly move up a little bit. Okay. All right. Lauren has a good one here. The different types of humanism. Okay, Lauren, so I have some videos which would probably help you on the different types of humanism. And if you haven't been watching this, I'll say again, as I said early on, if you go to my YouTube channel, you just go to YouTube, you type in Paul Sargent, I'm going to show up. I've got close to 100 videos in there which cover different topics in European history. So a lot of the specific things that you're being asked about, or that you're asking me about, sorry, can be answered in those videos in probably a better format than me sitting here trying to off the cuff the thing and try and explain it as quickly as I can to move on to the next question. I really cover humanism really well, but it's an important concept. So let me give it like the 2-minute, which I'm really bad at, 2-minute explanation here. Okay, so humanism is the development of the ideas during the Renaissance, where it's this rediscovery and fascination with the writings of ancient Greece and Rome. And it's using those writings. Those writings are sort of outside of the traditional Catholic Church teachings, which say that man's purpose on earth is to get into heaven. And to glorify God. And these writers, from like pre-Christian writers, they say that there are other things that are important in life, like gaining knowledge for the sake of knowledge, like trying to improve one's lot in life, trying to improve one's happiness in life, trying to improve one's society and give back and things like that. And so the humanist ideal is trying to take those ancient ideas of Greece and Rome and apply them to a Christianized Catholic Europe. In terms of civic humanism, this is the belief that those people, that people should go out and they should become very educated. They should learn Greek and Latin. They should study the ancients. They should gain their wisdom, but then they should use that by getting involved in government. They should try and improve their societies architecturally or politically or economically. And they should do it not in order to glorify God, but in order to make their world better for having been in it, which is a pretty good thing according to the civic humanists. And Christian humanists are going to develop up in the north. Hold on one second. And they're going to emphasize using knowledge of Greek and Latin in order to analyze the writings of the early Catholic Church and early Catholic thinkers, and to maybe analyze the interpretation, or sorry, the the translation of the Bible and maybe get a better understanding of what the Bible really says. And so they're going to turn their attention of their knowledge of the classics onto studies of the Catholic religion in order to try and improve it. All of these are going to be, they're going to emphasize knowledge, and they're going to emphasize the use of knowledge. And that's really what humanism is at its heart. It's the belief that the individual has the power to change themselves and their society through the acquisition of knowledge, getting ideas in their head. That's going to kind of be used throughout European history, but it's good to go there. I'll jump a little bit here. Let's see. Someone said I look like they're dead, so I'm not answering your question. I don't know why. Maybe because my kids aren't in high school yet, so hopefully I don't look that old anymore. Yeah. Let's see. We have a question about where do we go here? Oh, someone's asking where Tom Ritchie is. He said he should be here any minute. Like, I promised this guy, and everybody jumps on and they're like, hey, you know, where's Tom Ritchie? We really want to see him. We don't want to see you. He's coming, I think. I hope. He told me what. We'll see. No, he said that he should be here. He should be here any minute, actually. Okay. We did that. I keep falling behind. I'm looking at questions from a long time ago. I'm going to go all the way to the most recent stuff here and see what, oh my gosh, you guys just hit me again with like another 12 things. Let's see. Okay, we've got Reformation and Council of Trent and stuff like that starting to show up. All right, so what was the Reformation all about? So the Protestant Reformation was a reaction against the Catholic Church. It started off as really protests, I guess. I mean, we're calling them Protestants, so they're protesting things, right? So they're going to really kind of speak out against some of the practices of the Catholic Church. In other words, they're not going to take on the ideas that the Catholic Church has about like Christianity or salvation or stuff like that initially. But they're going to really talk out against the practices. But Martin Luther is really the beginning of the Reformation, and he's really a guy who's concerned about his own salvation, and he seeks answers in the New Testament. And as he reads the New Testament, he starts to believe that maybe what the Catholic Church is saying is not exactly lining up with Scripture. And when he sees the Catholic Church openly selling indulgences, which are not really in his mind or his interpretation of it, given in the Bible or talked about in the Bible, that he reacts against this. And he creates this, or he sort of pushes this belief that salvation is achieved by faith alone. And not by doing all of the things that the Catholic Church asks people to do, tithing, going to Mass, taking communion, anything like that. Like that, if you have faith, you will be saved, because he sees that in the Bible. He also says that there's nothing in the Bible that says that priests have to be ordained by a church in order to be able to preach the Bible. And so he says, hey, anyone should be able to teach the Bible and to preach. There should be a priesthood of all believers, and that anyone can be qualified to do this if they, if they take the knowledge and read the Bible and they want to share their interpretations with people. Well, when Luther does this, it kind of opens the floodgates, and you have all kinds of different Protestant religions which begin challenging the Catholic Church. The most influential of this, and really the other Protestant reformer you need to know, I mean, you need to know Martin Luther, but you also need to know John Calvin. And John Calvin takes on a different interpretation of the Bible, which is largely characterized by an idea called predestination, which basically says that God is all-knowing and can see everything and know everything. And not only does he know the past and he knows the present and everything's going on, but he also knows the future, because he's all-knowing, and He therefore knows the future. And if he knows the future, that means he already knows who's going to be saved. And so we're predestined for salvation or not for salvation, depending on our situation. And that's already set by God. And it sounds, because, well, not a lot of religions these days really kind of go that far with it. It sounds very different to us. But today it's very ingrained in sort of everyday conversation. If people say, hey, you know what? Things will always work out for the best, or, maybe it's not meant to be, or God has a plan. This is sort of a modern Calvinist kind of approach to life, is that there's this greater plan which is driving things, and while we might make decisions, like, things are going to happen, and God has a plan for all of us, and there's nothing you can do about it, and it's going to be for the best, because it's God. Anyway, so as these Protestant religions challenge the Catholic Church then at the Council of Trent comes together and says, hey, you know what? We got to figure out how to respond to these things. And what they come out with is really two things. Number one, they say the doctrine, the beliefs of the Catholic Church are correct, and we're going to keep those. Nothing we're saying about salvation or religion or anything like that is wrong. However, we will acknowledge that some of the practices of people within the church need some changes. We need to make sure that priests can read Latin so that they can read the Bible and preach to their people. We need to make sure that we need to stop selling church offices to people who can just buy them because they're rich, and so then they want to be a bishop because they're like the third son of the Medici. So, like, we shouldn't sell them a church office, and then they set out to push Catholicism and to stop really the spread of Protestantism through banning books. They created an index of forbidden books, which lists books which shouldn't be read, by creating educational institutions, mostly run by the Jesuits, who are sort of a branch of the Catholic Church, and then by instituting inquisitions in Spain and in Rome, which are going to, well, more in Rome, I guess, which are going to kind of further, they're going to sort of like militarize, I guess. That's the wrong word. They're going to enforce, how about that, Catholic doctrine, and try and root out heretics, which is really what the church kind of sees itself as. Like, that's its goal, is you root out heretics. So the Catholic response, which is the Catholic Reformation, or sometimes referred to as the Counter-Reformation, is like a reaction to the Reformation, and it really creates a divide in Europe between Protestant states eventually and Catholic states, and they're going to be kind of, and they're going to fight wars over this stuff, over this division. So yeah, we're going to do that. Got all that stuff in there. Yes. Okay. Can you compare and contrast new and old imperialism, please? Okay. Yeah, this is one that gets a lot of people. Old imperialism, think about like the age of exploration. All right. It's very much an imperialism which is built off of, it's in different forms, but it's driven off creating colonies which are going to make the mother country richer. And they they go about this in a lot of different ways, but they're not really, they're able to create colonies, especially the Spanish. They're very successful. This is the Portuguese, I guess, and the British. Okay, there's lots of people who are successful at this. They create colonies in the Americas, but they're unable to really penetrate into Africa very well, and they're really unable to do a whole lot in Asia other than set up trading posts. The new imperialism comes around in the 19th century, and by this time, you have a Europe which is far more technologically advanced, and which has these factories which are like devouring raw materials, and they're pumping out finished goods. They're pumping out stuff that people can buy. And so what do they need? Well, they need more raw materials to devour, and they need more places where they can send stuff for people to buy. And so there's this renewed interest in trying to take colonies. Also, it's a form of like national competition between these countries who are trying to prove how great they are. And one measure of that is like the extent of their empire. The winner of this in the end, I guess, would be the British, because their empire is just like ridiculously huge. And so, but with the new imperialism, new weapons like the machine gun, combined with new understanding of medicine, which will allow the fighting of diseases in places where Europeans caught a lot of disease when they would try and go, like the interior of Africa. Those things are kind of overcome. And so then European colonies or European countries begin to target Asia and Africa, really, and they start to divide them up in this very quick, very I guess from a European standpoint, very successful takeover bid of the African continent and much of the Asian continent to create colonies that can get raw materials into the factories, and it could maybe kind of devour the stuff that's being produced from the factories. And also kind of it makes a lot of Europeans feel good because they see these people as being somewhat less civilized than Europeans. And so by colonizing them, they're bringing civilization. They build roads, they build bridges, they improve transportation systems, they build schools and things, and all in sort of an effort to try and improve the colonies, or improve the places they colonize, I guess. So that's really the two phases. Like the early phase is what you think about with like the age of exploration, and the American colonies and the Spanish Empire. And then you jump to the late 19th century, and that's where Africa and Asia are really colonized. That's the difference between the two. Okay. Let's see. I did that. Oh, hey, someone appreciates me. That's awesome. I love it. Okay, there's my gosh, you guys are all over the place. There's a lot of questions about a lot of things. All right, so to kind of like, I'm going to take a moment here and kind of give you a resource which I hope will help you. I'm going to do a screen share here, and I'm going to say I want to screen share this. All right. So this is my website. It's at sargenotes.com. If you have questions about a lot of the specifics, like here I've got places for the historical themes, the thinking skills, the concept outline, which really lists all of the things that you need to know for the test. And if you haven't looked at this, like it's right here. So if you don't understand a lot about period 3 with like what you need to know about the Industrial Revolution, or what you need to know in the 20th century about politics, well, you can click on that and it'll give you kind of the big idea. And this is straight from the College Board. I did not write this. And then here's exactly what they want you to understand about different things. So the Cold War here played out on a global stage and involved propaganda campaigns, covert actions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And whenever you see something bulleted, this is stuff which are examples that you can use, but which won't be like tested. So for example, if you see someone's name written in one of these areas, it could be right there on the test. And if you see the bullet things, then it can't be right there on the test, but you can use it as an example. But then the other thing that is a good resource is if you go to my YouTube channel, you just search Paul Sargent, and you'll come up here. And then I have really 2 playlists, the bit by bit and then the European history videos. And they have videos that hit all kinds of different topics all throughout the course. So you can see, I mean, there's a lot here. So hopefully these resources will help you out, and you'll be able to kind of you know, get a bunch of your questions answered as you go through there, that you're not sure about. All right, we're gonna see what else we have here. Let's see, we did that. I got a shout out with, yeah, hey, nice. That's really cool. Let's see. Let's see. Bob's asking, how long will this last, the live video? Not a whole lot longer. If you're hearing my voice, you know that I'm struggling. In fact, I hope that Tom Ritchie shows up pretty soon, because I need him to give me a little break here and let him talk for a few minutes as we go around. For those of you who are interested, Tom and I will be doing a live review tomorrow night, starting at 8 o'clock, and that's like the night before thing, you know. Hopefully, I have the stamina I did last year. I made it till about 11:30 last in night. Yeah, you see, I'm out of my stamina here. I made it till close to midnight actually last year. So we'll see. A lot of this stuff I've already talked about here, there are things like, you know, the Crimean War, which really you don't need to know very much. You don't really know really anything about it. The Spanish Inquisition, you really don't need to know anything about, although it makes for some great stories. There is questions about, oh, you know what? This is a good question. What about modern stuff? There is always this question of like how far the course should go, like where the course is going to end. There's no like end date, and the end part of the course description that the College Board gives us is really kind of vaguely worded when it gets towards the modern day. But I would say that you know, aside from trends that are evident in modern Europe, including you know, trends of immigration, and you know, maybe like this Europe that's struggling to maintain its traditional European identity with the influx of people who are decidedly non-European in culture and belief and customs and whatever else, and that there's sort of this backlash. So like Brexit could be an example of that, but things which have happened in the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, I would say you're not really going to see anything about them. In fact, I would be surprised if you saw anything after that specified a particular event after, let's just say 2000 for a rough estimation. And partially that's because like historians really haven't had a time to process that stuff yet. And partially it's because the people who write the exam have to understand, and they do understand, that there are a lot of schools where people are still working off of textbooks from 10, 15 years ago. And if you've got a textbook from 10 or 15 years ago, you know, it's hard to write a test or to give a test about something which happened like last week. Now, obviously, there's other ways to keep up with the news, and I realize that, but still, like something like Brexit won't show up. And Brexit, I guarantee you won't show up because, well, guarantee is rough. I probably say won't show up because I bet most of this stuff was written before Brexit anyway, and that would just be uncool because that's in no one's textbooks. Like no textbook has Brexit in it, and if it does, if your textbook has Brexit in it, then I don't know. I mean, that was last summer, and I was in London on the day of the Brexit vote. It really was kind of freaky. Anyway, Bolshevik Revolution I talked about. I think some of you are starting to answer each other's questions because you realize I can't keep up with you guys. So let's see. I'm seeing a lot of questions about and they're kind of like repeat questions about Metternich and Bismarck and stuff like that. I have videos which cover those things, and they cover them in a detail which I think is much better, especially when you look at like the nationalist movements or the movements of national unification of Italy and Germany. Like those stories really deserve some time because they are very like they're very complex. And so I would say go check out my videos for those, because that way I can develop the story a little bit, which I can't really do here. But the Metternich question I think is a good one, because it probably is going to be something that you're going to see. And Metternich's importance comes out as a result of the Congress of Vienna. And you see, I'm going to start my question just like you should start your essay, okay? Any essay you write, contextualize first. So in 1815, Europe is faced with the need to figure out what the heck to do after all of the destruction of the Napoleonic Wars and like the removal of almost every ruling family in Europe. And so they come together and they start to talk this thing out. The driver of the discussion becomes this guy, Clemens von Metternich, who is Austrian, and he pushes a conservative ideology that traditional monarchies need to be placed back on the thrones of Europe. That they need to, the borders need to go back to the way they were. That the old ways really should come back, that the turmoil of the French Revolution, the Napoleonic era, shouldn't change the way Europe like functions, because like we ended it, we beat them. Napoleon's over there on an island called Elba. He ain't coming back until he does, and then they have to kind of like break away from the Congress and go shut down Napoleon again. Then they like push him further away. It's like, okay, now we got rid of him, he ain't coming back, so now we can sit down and talk about what we really need to do. Metternich also pushes, once they've agreed to all of this stuff and all of the families, all the traditional families are sort of put back on the thrones, then Metternich pushes the idea of the Concert of Europe, which is basically a way to enforce conservatism, so that these countries, and we're talking about Austria and eventually France and England and Prussia, like they're going to agree to shut down any liberal revolutions which rise up and attempt to overthrow legitimate monarchs. And they're going to work together to do that. And they do shut down uprisings in places like Spain. I also aid uprisings in places like Greece, where the Greek Revolution against the Ottoman empires, begins, and like the concert kind of goes and like, hey, you know what? We kind of don't like the Ottoman Empire either. Well, I mean, we kind of need it because it's just gonna be a mess if it falls apart. But you're Greek, and like we'd like to see you be independent. And so, they jump on there. So anyway, Metternich is really sort of the architect of conservatism and like maintaining this conservative alliance, which will preserve the old world and the old way of doing things. Oh my gosh, the cavalry has arrived. This is awesome. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the man, the myth, and the legend who's shown up. And Tom, I've been going for an hour and 45 minutes straight talking, so I'm going to turn it over to you for a couple minutes and let you go.
Okay, well, yeah, good luck with that. I think I've just spent about 3.5 hours this evening doing online tutoring. So like, wow. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, let's see what we've got here. All right, so let's see. Do we have any questions? Paul, if you want to put something over there at me, we'll see. I don't have any questions being asked. Let's see. As far as that, it looks like somebody's been okay. So guess I'm prepared. All right, or something. Okay, I don't know. I'm looking for a question. So what could?
Yeah, I got a lot of them coming in here. How about? There's a lot of questions that are about Bismarck and
okay. I see something, and Brittany, who is following. Thank you so much, Brittany. Bloor 17 Bloor. All right. So Bismarck and Cavour. Okay. So as far as this goes, and the thing is, I'm just going to go ahead and say that I am much more comfortable with German unification than I am Italian unification. But I think there are some, of course, Paul's got a great video on Italian unification. Anytime people ask me about Italian unification, I direct them there. And so as far as that goes, that with German and Italian unification, Bismarck and Cavour both use a version of realpolitik. Okay, so essentially Bismarck is using warfare in order to, basically unite Germany. So first of all, you've got the Schleswig Wars where he's like, hey, Austria, let's go attack Denmark. He gets Austria all overextended, and then he attacks Austria. And so then it establishes Prussia's dominance in Germany. And finally, nobody wants to be a loser. And so Bismarck, in order to complete this process of German unification, then he starts the Franco-Prussian War. Of course, he gets the French to start it. That's the whole genius of Bismarck with the whole Ems dispatch. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to make them start it. So very interesting as far as a tactic, very effective tactic. Abraham Lincoln did a similar thing with the American Civil War. It's like put the bait out there and let them start it. Very, very smart. And so at the same time, so basically Bismarck used warfare, and Bismarck said, it's not going to be because of liberalism. Prussia's position in Europe will not be determined by its liberalism, but by its power. And this is something that I think if you're going to do another comparison of the Italian and German unification movements, is that 1848 is a big turning point, because in Germany, in the German states, you've got the Frankfurt Parliament, and the Frankfurt Parliament tries unsuccessfully to create a constitution for a united Germany. Whereas so the Frankfurt Parliament tries to do that and it fails. Meanwhile, they create the Roman Republic in Italy, which is also a failure, okay, which is something. So you see that basically 1848 is basically a turning point from a liberal or romantic, depending on what you are, like a liberal romantic kind of revolution into a more realpolitik sort of thing. So, Cavour, for example, allied with France, to try to get French help against Austria. So it's like, we'll use the military and use alliances in order to further our interests. So this is something that's important. Now, Garibaldi, who was the military commander in the Italian unification movement, that first Garibaldi before 1848 was with Mazzini, Mazzini's Young Italy movement, which was a much more romantic, kind of movement. Whereas later on, he says, look, I didn't really trust this Cavour guy, but it looks like this Cavour guy gets stuff done. And so, that's what you're looking at as far as comparing Bismarck and Cavour, both very, very shrewd operators. Now, also Cavour wants Piedmont, Sardinia to be the dominant state. Okay. The dominant state in Italy, just like Bismarck didn't just want to unify Germany. He wanted to unify Germany under Prussian dominance. Okay. Maddie, I tell you what, that was a really good one. I'm gonna have to follow her back. That's let's see. She's asking who's Hitler. All right, probably a little late for that. Probably a little late for that one. Ashley, could I please explain the revolutions of 1848? Okay, so Ashley, I would be glad to tell you that I already have. I've got like a 5-part series on the revolutions of 1848. Now, the thing is, I would say that if you're wanting to make a 3, watch the first part, okay? Because what I did when I went into this, I don't know if any of y'all use the Palmer text, but I took notes on the Palmer text and just made sure that I had like every nook and cranny, looked at a few other books and sources. And so I really wanted to put together a very comprehensive view of the revolutions of 1848. But in the first lecture, I've got a basically a formula, okay? Because the revolutions of 1848 were failures, okay, generally failed revolutions, but it was a lot of, a lot of stuff going on, a lot of, uproar. Metternich had to leave Austria to go to England for a little while, but then he came back. Okay, he got better and came back. Basically everything came and went. And another thing to remember, remember Ashley, is that you have this situation where Britain and Russia don't experience revolutions now for two different reasons. Okay, so it's like, why wasn't there a revolution in Britain or a revolution in Russia? Well, the lack of a revolution in Britain is largely because of the government basically being accommodated. Now, the British government, I've got a lecture series on reform in Britain in the early 19th century, but the British government, while they didn't listen to the Chartists, they made some other reforms, the Mines Act, the 10-Hour Act, the repeal of the Corn Laws. So essentially the Chartist movement kind of was dying out by the time this was going on. And, it was the sort of thing that if people can see their government responding, then they are not as prone to try to, violently overthrow that government through revolution. And so as far as that goes, that's why you don't have it in Britain. Now, Russia, for the opposite reason, Russia had such a repressive government. If you look at the Decembrist Revolution, where some Russian military officers tried to challenge the Tsar. Well, the Tsar, shot a bunch of people and strung up some people. I think it was the last public hanging in the history of Tsarist Russia. With that sort of thing, the Russians built such a repressive regime that nobody really dared to challenge that regime in 1848. Of course, the Russians would get what was coming to them, later on in 1917. Okay, that's finally going to boil over. But for that time, oppression worked. Okay, oppression worked. Okay, so as far as that goes, Laura, we've got here even added, she replied to her own tweet. Okay, replied to her own tweet.
Hey, Tom, I've got a question for you here.
Yes.
This one I've never seen in a review, so I'm going to put it out to you, and I just want to see the reaction. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Melanie Wells wants to know, if I pass out during my exam, will I get a 3? I think she's really strategizing here.
They've got that whole rumor that if somebody in the room dies, then everybody passes or something like that. And as far as I know, that's a false rumor. Okay, that's a false rumor. But interesting there. If you pass out, now it would depend. You know what? If technically, okay, if we want to treat this as a serious question, and I suppose we'll pretend it was, right. Of course, who's to say she's not serious, right? And so when it comes down to it, if you passed out before the LEQ and you had made 40 out of 50 on the multiple choice, you got about half the points on the SAQ, and you wrote a 6 or a 7 DBQ. Then if you passed out then, you could still pass. I mean, technically, if you just wanted after the DBQ, if you were just like, look, I freaking killed it and I'm happy with a 3, and you want just mic drop with your pencil and just walk out of there, I wouldn't recommend that kind of behavior. Okay. But, if we are looking at hypotheticals and that sort of thing, that, the LEQ is one of those things that if you did well enough on the other stuff, you technically wouldn't even have to do it. But why take any chances with that? At least get a few points on that. But yeah, that was an interesting question, Paul. I never really thought about it like that. Hey, we're just gonna pass out before the thing's over. But just stay away from stuff that's going to make you pass out before you take the exam. I had a few students take the AP government exam stoned one time. Didn't work out too well for them. It didn't work out too well. I mean, it was just basically almost everybody in the class that took the exam not stoned passed. So yeah, just stay away from any kind of intoxicants or anything like that. It's good advice. Not
the day to start sniffing glue again, right?
Exactly.
So listen, but there's a serious thing what you were talking about actually brought up something that I think is an important point to make, which is, when you're timing yourself as you're writing and taking this test, you may find a situation, Tom was talking about maybe the LEQ would be something that you could almost not answer. But I think in a more, in maybe a less extreme situation, you may find that the DBQ is on a topic that you know really well, and that the documents you really want to work on. And you look at the LEQ topics and you're like, this is going to be rough. I'm going to be like grabbing at points on this one. But so maybe you take more time writing the DBQ to make sure you do it well and to make sure you get as many points as possible. And you sort of strategize and you say, hey, look, I'm not going to write a great LEQ anyway. So why spend 25 minutes writing a bad LEQ when I could grab an extra 10 minutes on my DBQ and then I could write a 15-minute bad LEQ? That might be a trade-off which is worth it. And if you're strategizing on the multiple choice, maybe you skip multiple choice questions that are around a stimulus that you don't understand. If you don't understand what it's saying, then maybe you skip those and you maybe come back to them after you're finished with everything else, with the understanding that if you run out of time, you've skipped something that you're probably not going to do well on anyway. And so, you just sort of throw in some bubbles and hope for the best on that one,
Yeah, and that's one thing I tell students all the time, like on the DBQ and the LEQ, that the first thing you do is look at the LEQ topics and figure out, like, okay, which one is either the better one or the lesser of the two evils and all of that kind of stuff. So, that is, something that pick the LEQ that you're going to write and figure out what you're trying to get on it, because you don't need 35 minutes to write a 3 or a 4 LEQ. You can do that in 15 minutes. And so as far as that goes, I'm a big advocate of figuring out, like, am I going for the strong LEQ strategy or the weak LEQ strategy? And I think, because what we're trying to do at the end of this exam is accumulate points. So if you've concluded that, like, look, both of those LEQ topics, like, I am screwed there. Now, the DBQ topic doesn't matter what it is, because you should be able to get at least 5 points on the DBQ, even if you know nothing about anything else, if you understand documents. So that's something to keep in mind as far as that. Now, as far as somebody asked about synthesis, okay, so we're talking about synthesis. And you've got to extend the argument. That's basically all I can tell you. Now, of course, if you want to subscribe to my eight-month writing clinic and all that kind of stuff, but synthesis, it extends the argument. Okay, so in just a setting like this, it's not just a simple comparison. So that's something that I think is important, that it has to further your thesis. And so we'll talk about that a little more. I'm going to be I'm going to be broadcasting tomorrow night. Paul's going to be a guest on there. So that's going to be happening at 8 p.m. tomorrow. And then I'll be doing Breakfast with Richie, 4th annual Breakfast with Richie at 9 a.m. On Friday. So as far as that goes, I'll be there. And, Paul, I don't know about you. I'm feeling especially exhausted, and I probably got to kind of go start resting up for tomorrow. Because, big day tomorrow, of course, big day on Friday. So I want to make sure that I'm not losing steam by that time. But remember, ladies and gentlemen, y'all should be seeing those little 6-second ads for my Romulus app. It's been a busy week, and my partner was like, hey, can you at least do one of these 6-second ads? I was like, yeah, I can do that. So I made just a 6-second ad for the app. It's only $2.99. You can try it out for free. Check it out. And so Romulus, humanism, right? And so as far as that goes, make sure, come to those broadcasts and all of that kind of stuff. And Paul, thank you very much for letting me drop by. And I think I'm going to go, maybe watch another episode of 13 Reasons Why before I fall asleep watching it. Or that's been basically my AP week kind of routine, is just I'll put something on and then within 10 minutes, I'm just out.
Hey, I'm right there with you, and I am running out of gas too. And as a distance runner, I know that we still got a long way to go. So we should rest up for tomorrow. So to everyone out there, hey, tonight is the night where you really want to hammer stuff. Okay, tonight is the night where you can afford to stay up a little bit later. You can afford to put some more stuff in your brain. But tomorrow night is the night where you really want to make sure you get enough sleep. Now, that whether this means that you're going to have a chance to sleep in a little bit, whatever, that'd be great. But tonight, try and get your studying done, and then tomorrow try and get some sleep. And I guess Tom and I will be back tomorrow night. And so look for can't even talk anymore. Look for advertisements with a link to that on Twitter if you follow Tom Ritchie, or if you go to his website at tomritchie.net, he'll have the link there for you. And I'll retweet his link as well when everything goes out. So good night. Thank you very much. And good luck in your studying, guys. We are 36 hours away. No, almost 36 hours away, just a little bit over 36 hours away from the exam. Now, some of you just had a heart attack when I said that, and some of you said, oh, yes, I'm so ready, and this will finally just be behind me. Whichever way it is, go into it, do your best, and we'll see you tomorrow night. Good night.